Hey, this is Gary with Jolly Dolly, and I'm going to show you how to change out an ASI axle with a CCL axle on a Power Pro motorized dolly. First, we're going to lay the dolly down on its belly and remove the rear cover plate by taking out the Phillips screws that hold it in place. Be careful with all the charger wires. Some dollies will have LED lights or battery indicators on the back panel that you may need to disconnect. If so, take note of how they're connected or take a picture of them. Now we're going to remove the tires using a 3/4 socket or lug wrench. Some dollies will have a brake cover that looks like this. If yours does, remove it by taking out the 3 Phillips screws from inside the cabinet that hold it in place. Now we're going to disconnect power to the dolly before we swap out the wires. If your dolly has a gray quick connect like this, you simply pull it apart and that will kill the power. If not, you can pull the fuse and accomplish the same thing. Now we're going to locate and identify the 3 wires that come into the cabinet from the axle. There's the white and black switch wire, the brown and blue brake wire, and the motor wires. We're going to start with the motor wires. They're the large red and black wires that go to the bottom 2 screws on the motor controller. Remove the Phillips screws that hold them in place and try to retrieve the screws and washers so you can reuse them. If you lose them, we should have some extras included in your kit. Now we're going to locate the brake wire, which is plugged into the controller with a 2-pin harness. Squeeze the little release tab and pull the connector out. Last but not least, you're going to disconnect the black and white switch wires. Pay close attention here. After you disconnect these wires, you're going to connect the black and white wires in the dolly to themselves. This is extremely important because it bypasses the switch, which does not exist on the new axle. If you skip this step, the dolly will not function. Now you can push the grommet through the wire hole and retrieve all the wires. Next, we're going to remove the bolts that tie the top of the axle into the dolly through the foot pedal. And you're going to do this using a 7/16 socket and wrench. Now we're going to go ahead and remove the main axle mounting bolts. This will be done with a 1/2-inch socket and wrench if needed. Lift the axle straight up out of the dolly. The trick is to lift up on the motor to relieve the pressure on the mounts. You're going to place the new axle into the dolly. Note that the brake release lever needs to be facing up and it's going to be on the opposite side of the old axle. Sometimes you have to lift up on the motor to get it to fully seat. You're going to want to check your gap right to left. Some of the axles will be a little bit shorter than the mounts. In that case, you want to equalize the gap on each side. Now you're going to want to route your wires into the wire hole. There's no need to reuse the grommet. In fact, the grommet will not work here. The wires are too big. Working from inside the dolly, you're going to want to start with your brake wire. That's the one with the 2-pin connector. And you're going to plug that into the motor controller, making sure the locking tab is on the correct side and that it's fully seated and locked into place. Now you're going to start with your motor wires. Make sure you're using the correct screws with the lock washer. If you lost a lock washer, replace it with one that we put in your kit. Notice that the motor wires are color coded. You have yellow and blue. The yellow goes on the top screw and the blue goes on the bottom screw. Make sure these screws are tight. You don't want to accidentally strip the screw, but you do want to make sure it's as tight as possible. When you're finished, it should look like this. Now you can power the dolly back up by replacing the fuse if it's been removed and or by plugging the quick connector for the battery back up. Now we can go ahead and test the dolly and make sure that the directions are correct, forward and reverse. Now we're going to put our axle ties back in place. Notice that the holes through the axle tie are closer to one side than the other, and this needs to match the bottom axle tie. It's supposed to be the hole is closer to the inside. Now we're going to take our flange nut and go ahead and thread that on both sides, both bolts. Repeat this for the other side, and again, make sure that the hole orientation matches the top and bottom axle tie. You can see that the hole is closer to one side than the other, and it has to be the same top and bottom. As you tighten these bolts, you have to tighten one, then the other, back and forth, a little bit at a time. You don't want to pinch one side. When you're finished, these should be all the way torqued down. There should be no gap between the axle tie and the axle support. Now we're going to mount the foot pedal back in place using the existing hardware. There's a spacer that goes on the head of the bolt before you put it through the dolly. It's important to reuse this spacer. If not, the foot pedal will jiggle around no matter how tight you make the bolt. Now we're going to put the tires back on. It's important when doing this to make sure the tapered side of the lug nut goes facing the wheel. You want to lift up on the tire and hand tighten the first lug nut. You're trying to make sure that these lug nuts are centered in the tire hole, and this can be trickier than it sounds. You want to start with the first two nuts, hand tighten, wiggle that tire around to make sure everything's centered before you put the second two nuts on. Now you should notice that the second two holes are already centered before you thread the nuts on. Now you can start to tighten the first two nuts back and forth, and then go for the second nuts, making sure that everything stays centered, and then you can go ahead and torque these nuts down. You don't want to get too crazy, but you do want them tight enough so that they don't come loose. When you put your back cover on, make sure all of your chargers are connected and make sure none of the wires get pinched. Make sure this lays flat before you put the screws in. Once you're sure everything is done, go ahead and drive the dolly. Make sure it drives smooth. Make sure there's no issues. If you have any questions, you can always contact us. The best way is on our Facebook page. You can private message us and we'll respond usually nights and weekends to help you with any problems you might have. Thanks and have a jolly day.